the Elizabethan curriculum, a classical education for the modern man. Lecture 18, Plutarch, Antony, Coriolanus, and the varieties of greatness undone. Mark Antony is the most compelling failure in Plutarch's lives, and Plutarch knows it, and the knowledge gives the life of Antony a quality that none of the other lives quite has. It is written with a fascination that is almost helpless, the biographer unable to look away from a man who seems to be conducting his own destruction with the energy and panache that lesser men bring to their greatest achievements. Antony does not drift toward his end. He strides toward it magnificently with banners flying, and Plutarch watches with the expression of a man who finds the spectacle simultaneously appalling and irresistible. He begins by establishing Antony's physical presence, because with Antony, the physical is inseparable from everything else. He was, Plutarch tells us, extraordinarily handsome in a particular mode. The broad forehead, the aquiline nose, the thick beard, a face that resembled the portraits of Hercules, and he cultivated this resemblance deliberately. The Antony family claimed descent from Hercules, and Antony dressed and carried himself in ways that emphasized the connection. This was not vanity in the simple sense. It was political theater of a high order, in a world where the visual language of power was inseparable from mythological association. To walk through the streets of Alexandria looking like Hercules was a statement about who you were and what you represented. His character was, Plutarch says, with characteristic precision, a mixture of greatness and weakness in proportions that were almost exactly equal, which is what made him so interesting and so dangerous. His generosity was real and limitless. He gave away money, offices, provinces, kingdoms, with a carelessness that his admirers found magnificent and his political opponents found terrifying. His personal courage was never in question. His loyalty to those he loved was absolute, which is a virtue with a particular capacity to become a catastrophic flaw when the person you love is Cleopatra and the thing you are sacrificing for that love. Plutarch is careful to show us the Antony who might have been before he shows us the Antony who was. The young Antony before Cleopatra, before Alexandria, before the slow abandonment of everything that Rome represented in him, was a superb soldier and a capable administrator, the man who held Caesar's coalition together after the assassination, who delivered the funeral speech that turned Rome against the conspirators, who managed the aftermath of the most dramatic political murder in Roman history. This Antony, the political animal operating in the Roman world at full capacity, was formidable. The question Plutarch is implicitly asking throughout the life is what happened to him. Where did this man go? The answer Plutarch gives is Cleopatra, but not in the simple moralistic sense of the woman who corrupted the great man. Plutarch's Cleopatra is considerably more interesting than that, and his portrait of her is one of the most remarkable things in the lives, because she is not technically one of the subjects. She is a supporting character in Antony's biography, and yet she dominates it, which is itself a biographical observation of considerable subtlety. The woman who is not the subject of the life is the subject of the life. Plutarch's famous description of her first arrival to meet Antony at Tarsus is the passage that Shakespeare would transform into Enobarbus's great speech in Antony and Cleopatra, the speech that begins the barge she sat in like a burnished throne. Plutarch's version is already theatrical. The gilded barge, the silver oars, the sails of purple, the boys like painted cupids fanning her, the women dressed as sea nymphs, Cleopatra herself under a canopy of gold cloth dressed as Venus. The entire city has emptied to watch from the banks. Antony sits alone in the marketplace, waiting for her, attended only by his own dignity and the growing realization that nobody else is coming. She has arranged the encounter so that he waits for her, which reverses the power dynamic that his position as Rome's representative should have established, and she has done it with such theatrical completeness that he has no graceful response available except admiration. This is a woman of political and personal intelligence operating at the highest level, and Plutarch knows it. Cleopatra is not primarily a beauty, though he acknowledges she was attractive. She is primarily a mind. Her power over Antony was, he tells us, not physical, but intellectual and emotional. She was endlessly stimulating, endlessly surprising, endlessly capable of finding the new angle on a situation that made it interesting. Again, she spoke 9 languages. She was the first of the Ptolemaic line to bother learning Egyptian. She could talk to Antony about anything, and she always had something to say that he had not thought of. For a man of Antony's temperament, a man who needed to be interested, who needed the constant stimulation of a world that matched his own energy, this was not merely attractive. It was the thing he could not live without once he had encountered it. Plutarch traces the deterioration with the patience of a clinician documenting a condition he understands completely and cannot cure. Antony's absences from Rome, each one a little longer, his adoption of Eastern dress and Eastern customs, each step a little further from the Roman identity that was his political foundation, his distribution of Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children, each gift a little more indefensible in Roman eyes, and through it all, the growing gap between what Octavian was building in the West, the careful, patient construction of a new order on the ruins of the old, and what Antony was dissolving in the East, the gradual surrender of everything that had made him the man he was. Octavian is the necessary counterpoint to Antony throughout the lives, and Plutarch's handling of him is instructive. He does not present Octavian as a villain any more than he presents Cleopatra as a seductress. He presents him as a phenomenon of a different kind from Antony, a man of considerably lesser personal gifts, physically unimpressive, not particularly brave in the field, not particularly charismatic in person, who possessed instead a quality, the willingness to wait, to build, to consolidate, to let events develop, rather than forcing them to be boring in the service of something that would last. Octavian understood that the Roman world needed stability more than it needed magnificence, and he provided stability for 45 years with a consistency and a political intelligence that Plutarch respects, even when he does not warm to it. The contrast between the two men is, in Plutarch's hands, a meditation on what kind of greatness the moment required. Antony's greatness was of the kind that is most visible and most immediately compelling. The greatness of the soldier and the lover and the man of magnificent appetites. Octavian's greatness was of the kind that is least visible in the moment and most consequential over time, the greatness of the administrator and the political architect. Rome needed the second kind. History, which is patient in ways that individual lives are not, gave it what it needed in the form it needed, and the man who provided it became Augustus, the most successful ruler the ancient world produced. The Battle of Actium in 31 before the Christian era, where Octavian's fleet defeated Antony's, is handled by Plutarch with a notable absence of drama, because the drama had already happened. The battle was not lost at Actium. It was lost in the years of drift and distribution and the slow accumulation of decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation and were collectively. Actium was the moment when the accumulated weight of all of it became visible, and Plutarch's quiet account of the battle reflects this. The end was not a surprise, it was a confirmation. Antony and Cleopatra both die by their own hands in Alexandria, each with a particular quality that is entirely characteristic. Antony's death is botched. He asks his servant Eros to kill him. Eros kills himself instead. Antony then falls on his own sword and fails to die immediately, lingers, is brought to Cleopatra's monument where she is barricaded, is hoisted up to her by ropes because she will not open the doors, and dies in her arm. It is undignified and human and rather moving, which is exactly right for Antony. He cannot even die with the clean simplicity that the occasion requires. Everything is complicated. Everything requires improvisation. Everything ends in something between tragedy and farce. Cleopatra's death, by contrast, is entirely composed. She dresses in her royal robes, arranges herself, and receives the asp, if asp it was, with the deliberate ceremony of a queen performing a state function. She has calculated that Octavian will parade her through Rome in his triumph, which is the one thing she will not endure, and she removes that possibility with the same political intelligence she brought to everything. Her last act is a political act. She dies as she lived, on her own terms, which is more than Antony managed. Now to Coriolanus, who stands at a considerable remove from the world of Caesar and Antony, but who illuminates something about the Roman character and about the relationship between military virtue and political life that none of the other lives quite reaches. Gaius Marcius Coriolanus was a Roman soldier of the early Republic, legendary rather than fully historical, who took his cognomen from his capture of the Volscian city of Corioli. He was, in Plutarch's account, a man of extraordinary military virtue and equally extraordinary social inflexibility. He despised the common people with a completeness and a candor that Roman political life, which required at least the performance of popular respect, could not accommodate. He said what he thought, which was that the plebeians were unfit for political power, that the grain dough was a corruption of Roman virtue, that the tribunate was an illegitimate institution, and he said these things in public with the directness of a man who believes that truth is a sufficient justification for any statement regardless of its consequences. He was exiled for it, and his response to exile was to go to the Volsces, Rome's enemies, and offer to lead them against the city that had expelled him, which he then proceeded to do with such success that he brought a Volscian army to the gates of Rome itself. The city sent embassy after embassy to negotiate. He refused them all. He was going to destroy Rome, or he was going to be recalled in triumph, and there was no third option available as far as he was concerned. The third option was found, as it always is, by the people. He could not refuse. His mother, Volumnia, his wife, his children, came to his camp outside the walls. Volumnia spoke to him, and what she said Plutarch does not entirely report, giving us the broad argument rather than the speech itself, which Shakespeare will remedy with one of the greatest maternal orations in dramatic literature. The argument was essentially this: if you destroy Rome, you destroy everything that made you, and if you spare Rome, you will be killed by the Volscians for your mercy, and either way your life is over. But one way ends in a kind of honor, and the other ends in a kind of damnation, and you will choose honor, because that is what you are. He wept, he spared the city, he was killed by the Volscians. Plutarch's account of his end is brief and without ceremony, which is itself a judgment. The man who made his life into a monument to a particular idea of Roman virtue died as a consequence of the one moment when that virtue bent toward something human, toward the claims of love and family over the claims of pride and principle. He died for being just once a son before he was a soldier. Plutarch pairs Coriolanus with Alcibiades, the brilliant and disastrously self-destructive Athenian general, who also betrayed his city and also died in exile, and the comparison illuminates both. Alcibiades was flexible, where Coriolanus was rigid, charming, where Coriolanus was brutal, capable of being anything the situation required, where Coriolanus could only be himself, both destroyed by the same fundamental incapacity to exist within the constraints that political life imposes on even the most gifted individuals. The city needs you to be less than you are. If you refuse, the city will find a way to be rid of you. In our next lecture, we close the Plutarch module with Antony's counterpart. In Shakespeare's imagination, the life that Plutarch wrote, which has generated the least theatrical attention and the most political anxiety, the life of a man who appears briefly in our story already, who managed the extraordinary achievement of outlasting everyone, and whose biography raises the question that Plutarch returns to again and again throughout the lives, whether the wisest response to a world that destroys the great is to be, strategically and deliberately, something less than great. End of lecture 18.